A while ago, I uploaded an interview I did with Dr. Gerhard, the phenomenologist. For those who don't know, a phenomenologist studies the behavior of groups of people, whereas a psychologist studies the behavior of individual people. In the last interview, we discussed the psyche of the white or European South African under the current conditions in South Africa. At the time, I promised that I would do another interview with him that would cover the other side of the coin, namely the psyche of the black people of Africa or South Africa. Unfortunately, Dr. Gerhard has been traveling and it took me quite a while to pin him down when he was at home, but I have managed to get another interview with him. This interview was recorded at very short notice, and I am also trying out a new headset which created a unique problem that I have not seen before. Although Dr. Gerhard could hear me and I could hear him, only his voice was recorded for some reason. What I have had to do was to re-record my voice and edit it back into the original recording. You might notice a difference in audio levels, etc., and a slightly different sound for my voice, but unfortunately that's the way it is. But this interview was way too interesting to delete and wait until I get a chance to redo it with him. So I'm going to publish it as is. After all, it's the content that counts and not the quality of the audio, right? So here goes. Enjoy. Gerhard, last time we spoke, we talked about the psychology of people, but specifically white or Western people, and how they were handling or coping with what is happening in South Africa these days. Today I would like to concentrate on the psychology of the African or black people and contrast that with Western European people, in the hope that we can understand why we have become so incompatible when just 25 years ago everyone was ready to become a part of this wonderful thing they call the Rainbow Nation.
Yes, after the 1994 general election, which brought the African National Congress to power in South Africa, minority groups really looked forward to help forging a golden future for everyone in South Africa, regardless of race, creed, and culture. But this has not happened. In the eyes of the ruling party, dominated by black African people of tribal descent, the members of minority groups with a Western background and culture are now regarded as settlers, destined to be reduced to second-class citizens. The ANC and its supporters now use their parliamentary majority against the minority groups to literally oppress them in every conceivable way, and the only role the minority groups are playing is that of scapegoats for whatever goes wrong in the country.
Yes, as you say, the whites have been blamed for every single problem or failure the government has had so far, right down to the weather. Why are white South Africans so demonized?
White South Africans are accused that their sense of superiority and their white privilege is the reason why the multicultural New South Africa is a failure. It is apparently the unwillingness of the white man to share his property and his wealth that is the cause of all the misery. The irony is that it is this very minority group who have and are still contributing almost all of the taxes and income on which the government and millions of unemployed citizens in South Africa depend, and who are providing the major part of the skills and the conscientiousness for the country's economy.
Do you think that this is the attitude of all the black population? In other words, do they all tend to think like this, or is this situation more complicated than this?
It is often stressed that one should never forget that by far the majority of black people are in fact moderate and just as frustrated as we are about the politics in the country. Like everyone, most black people just want to live their lives in peace and have a job and be happy. When we speak to these people on an individual level, they would even be outspoken against the ANC government and the state of the country. In my trade and walk, I encounter incredibly friendly and sincere blacks every day. And I then wonder, how have we ended up here? Why do the same majority of moderate black people still overwhelmingly vote for a corrupt and ineffective government and seemingly support all of its destructive ideas when it comes to the polls? It is very difficult for us to understand that a group of people can be kind and friendly on an individual level, but once they begin to act together as a collective or as a group, one gets a totally different impression of the group's personality. It is a universal fallacy of humans to expect that the minds of all people work in exactly the same way. But in fact, we have no idea how fundamentally different our cultural upbringing has caused our minds to be wired and programmed. We literally live in completely different worlds, which create from the inside out the clashing realities that we observe in the country. There's also a bigger picture that we need to see and understand. As individuals, we are each in our own way an organism that has a certain personality and behaves in a certain way. However, as part of a collective group, we acquire a completely different personality and become an organism that behaves in a very different way. What we observe as a civilization or as a country's political situation or as an economy is not the outcome of our individual personalities, but what you get when thousands of people think and act collectively.
So what you are actually saying is that individually people act in a certain way, and as soon as they form a group, they assume another identity or personality altogether and act totally different.
Yes, absolutely. This is one of the strange anomalies of the human psyche. In a certain sense, we are all suffering from a sort of multiple personality disorder. Eugene Marais was the first scientist to describe the difference between the behavior of individuals and their groups in his book, The Soul of the Ant. An anthill consists of thousands of individual ants, but as a collective, the ants actually function as a single animal or one greater organism. Psychology is the science that studies the behavior of individuals. However, there is also a behavioral science that studies the behavior of larger collective groups. And this is called phenomenology, which is the science in which I completed my PhD.
Okay, this is starting to make sense to me now and explains a lot of what is happening right now. Please carry on.
To explain in a very simple terms the difference between the minds of people from a tribal African background and those of people from a Western background and culture, I will use the analogy of computer software or applications as it is called these days. Our cultural values function like a computer's programs or a piece of software that you need for a certain practical task. But in order for that particular application to work, it needs to run on a certain operating system. If you download an app that was designed to run on an iPhone and wish to use it on an Android phone, for instance, it will not work properly if it runs at all because it was designed for a different operating system.
What can we consider to be the operating system of our minds?
I believe that the most fundamental software that our minds run on is our self-image or our self-concept, what you fundamentally perceive yourself to be. All other applications that you use will be running on this operating system of your self-concept or your self-image. Now, the main operating system that the Western mind runs on is the self-image of individualism. In other words, thinking about ourselves as individuals and therefore fundamentally being responsible for ourselves. However, there are people from many other cultures in the world who think in a collective or a social or a tribal way about themselves. In other words, in their self-concepts, they don't see themselves as an individual. They see themselves as an extension of their cultural group, with a group as being essentially responsible for them and their lives.
Understanding the human mind from a perspective of computer science certainly makes things much more comprehensible.
Absolutely. If the operating system that your brain runs on allows you to utilize certain mental applications or not, it becomes very clear why our minds work so differently. What has happened with the Western mind over the last 500 years was that their culture developed away from social tribalism, and they began to fundamentally see themselves as individuals who are responsible for their own lives. Now, I believe that Christianity played a big role in this program by holding a person responsible for his own conscious misbehavior, which the Bible calls sin. So whatever the reason, based on a self-concept of personal responsibility, a whole group of very unique mental applications could then be developed and be incorporated into Western thinking, which is very different from tribal thinking. Now, these are programs that will only run on the individualist operating system, and nothing else will be able to accommodate those apps. Just like Apple applications won't run on Android, these apps were actually responsible for the incredible advances made by Western culture, and it literally allowed Westerners to create the most advanced and successful societies in history.
So what you're saying is that Western people see themselves as individuals who are responsible for their own circumstances, their own failures, and ultimately their own destinies, whereas African people, when removed from the crowd, are not really able to think about themselves as individuals with personal responsibilities. But when they are in a group, they assume the group or collective mentality and hold the group, or someone else for that matter, responsible for their situation, their future, and ultimately, I would imagine, their welfare.
Absolutely. So a very simple underlying root belief that is mentally ingrained through cultural upbringing is actually preventing the African people from seeing how they could personally improve their own lives and create a much better future for themselves and everyone that they share the country with, simply by taking responsibility for their own lives. In other words, seeing themselves as individuals who can act on their own behalf and not only as being part of a larger collective group that actually undermines the individual from doing anything for himself.
What are the other mental apps you are referring to which run on the basic operating system of our self-concept?
I am referring to cultural values, values such as the following. The belief that we are personally responsible for our lives and well-being is then obviously the very first one. Another one is a value for education and the willingness to improve ourselves, which caused the development of science. Another one is conscientiousness and the belief in diligence and in hard work, but it also flows from taking personal responsibility. Then there's also a value and a respect for individual rights and for personal freedom. Another one is a value for private property rights and also for honesty, not taking something that belongs to another person. Another one is free markets and free trade. And then also a tolerance and a respect for competition. And another cultural value that the Western mind runs on is a respect for the law and a legal state. Now, a researcher and an author called Niall Ferguson wrote a book called Civilization, in which he shows how a combination of cultural values actually worked together to create such a successful and wealthy societies in the West over the last 100 years or so. Now, Ferguson writes the following. I'm going to quote him. The rise to global predominance of Western civilization is the single most important historical phenomenon of the last 500 years. All over the world, an astonishing proportion of people now work for Western-style companies, study at Western-style universities, vote for Western-style governments, take Western medicines, wear Western clothes, and even work Western hours. Yet, 600 years ago, the petty kingdoms of Western Europe seemed unlikely to achieve much more than perpetual internecine warfare. Now, he argues that beginning in around the 15th century, the West developed 6 very powerful new cultural values, which I call mental applications or mental pieces of software, that all the rest of societies lacked. Now, these are things like competition, science, the rule of law, consumerism, modern medicine, and also a solid work ethic. These were the killer applications that allowed the West to leap ahead of all the rest, opening global trade routes, exploiting newly discovered scientific laws, evolving a system of representative government, more than doubling life expectancy for people, members of their society, unleashing the industrial revolution, and embracing a dynamic work ethic. Just a dozen Western empires came to control more than half of humanity and 4/5 of the world economy.
So by studying history, we can learn that the Western approach is a recipe for success and power, while the African approach is a recipe for a people reliant on others for everything, and if they are left to their own devices, it is a recipe for total failure.
Absolutely, because of a very simple cultural root belief, which is the fundamental self-concept of seeing oneself not as an individual who can take responsibility for oneself and one's own welfare and future. Now, you will also notice that it is because of this very same root belief that all the Western cultural values on which South Africa's success was based in the past is now so fiercely disputed by the African majority in the country. The African mind running on the operating system of collective thinking and collective responsibility find it very difficult, if not totally impossible, to incorporate these Western applications or software into their thinking.
Can you provide some examples of this?
Yes, certainly. They claim, for instance, that South Africa is too Eurocentric and that our society, that our education system, the universities, and the entire economy is still dominated by Western culture. What in fact is happening is that the Western applications are creating a playing field in which a person from a tribalist, socialist background simply cannot compete. So Western values which are compatible with the African operating system are things like the belief that we are personally responsible versus the fact that they want to make the government or someone else responsible for them and are therefore naturally inclined to look for some other outside reason or cause or group to blame. Now, a value for education and the willingness to improve ourselves is another one, versus the burning down of the universities and the Africanization of the education system, which they are fighting for. Another one is conscientiousness and the belief in diligence and hard work, versus the African entitlement mentality that someone else owes you something, even if you have never done anything to deserve it or to earn it for yourself. One is a value for individual rights, freedom, and a value for private property rights and for honesty, versus the so-called appropriation of property, ambitions, and free everything for everyone, and also socialism and communism. Another one is free markets versus the demand for government social grants and social support. Another one is a tolerance and respect for competition versus the merchants and shop from bordering countries, the xenophobic attacks we currently experience in the country, the murder of our farmers, of truck drivers, all kinds of political opponents. Another one is a respect for the law versus the complete collapse of law and order and anarchy that we currently experience in our streets. The main reason for all of this is the fact that the operating system of the collectivist African social tribal mind find these Western mental applications incompatible with their own. And it is virtually impossible to change this operating system if you do not literally have centuries at your disposal. Now, the reality of this phenomenon has bitten the liberal West over and over again and is creating havoc all over the world in naive Western societies.
Can you again provide some examples of this?
Yes, all over the world, people from poor socialist cultures are migrating to Western countries with individualistic cultures, simply to share in the wealth and the political stability and prosperity that was created in those countries. Now, groups with a socialist tribal operating system will eventually dominate the individualist by using the strength of their numbers. In social tribal cultures, people need a lot of children for their own personal survival and to use as a sort of pension fund for themselves, because their societies never allowed them to create individual wealth for themselves, for which they could use to support themselves in their older days. The cultural groups that migrate to the Western countries do not make the adjustment with their numbers of accruals that our cultural group has learned to make, namely to keep our number growth and our economic growth in balance. So the necessary consequence is that the Westerners will soon be completely dominated in numbers, and political control will be taken over in just a few short years, as it has happened in South Africa. The respectful democratic systems based on the rule of law, which exist in the Western countries, unfortunately also work in favor of those in the majority. And these cultures will eventually also take over political control in those countries.
So you say that all this boils down to the fact that we have an individualist self-concept and the black Africans have a communal self-concept.
Precisely. It is actually as simple as that. As individuals, we have been taught to take responsibility for ourselves and to create our own wealth. Our culture has over hundreds of years developed the mental software, the political and legal mechanisms to respect and to protect individual rights and our property. In socialist cultures, everything belongs to everyone, and the respect for the right to the protection of individual property has never developed. So thus, wealth being created in individualistic societies is, of course, a huge temptation for socialist groups who are culturally neither permitted nor empowered to rise as individuals above others in their social groups. And because all people are inherently opportunistic, they will naturally attempt to follow the route of least resistance and do everything to get into a position where they can have access to and exploit the resources created and protected by individualistic societies over centuries. Now, everyone in those countries' living standards will eventually have to decline to represent the average wealth of the larger social group, just as it has happened and has been happening in South Africa over the past 25 years or so.
So the difference between the bigger and the smaller picture and the behavior of people at the individual and group levels is thus essential to understand if one wants to predict the outcome of the liberal political direction and policies.
Absolutely. We live in a causal world in which there is a natural consequence or outcome for every input or cause. What a man sows is what a man reapeth, as the Bible says. The things that most people do most of the time will naturally have a very specific end result that is actually quite predictable.
Okay, so from what you have just said, it is evident to me that we are two different people, each with a built-in pre-programmed way of seeing and dealing with life that are quite literally polar opposites of each other, and no amount of coercion or mixing is going to get the two to see or adopt each other's approach. or operating system as you call it. This tells me that we here in South Africa are in a very difficult and actually a totally predictable situation. Quite simply, if we remain as we are, there is no other outcome for us but to end up like all other failed African countries, since we are following the same course as they did, and therefore we cannot expect a different result. Would that be a fair statement to make?
Absolutely. I think that is in essence also my message tonight. My understanding of the larger and smaller picture of individual and group psychology is the main reason why I, as a phenomenologist, am convinced that the socialist and tribal collective African culture and the bit of Western culture still left in South Africa are totally incompatible with each other. Multiculturalism in this context is like trying to mix water and oil. If you leave the mixture alone for a few minutes, it will automatically separate itself again. There's no other logical solution for the physical and economic survival of Western cultural minorities in South Africa than to do everything in our power to achieve some form of self-determination very soon. Otherwise, our footprint and our culture will simply be wiped out in the next couple of decades.
The information Dr. Gerhard shared with me explains so much of what is happening in South Africa right now, as well as what has been happening all over Africa for years and years. It also explains why the so-called Rainbow Nation was and always will be a pipe dream. We are simply incompatible, no matter how hard we try to make it work. They want the benefits of the West, but are simply not capable of operating in the world that produced those benefits. This is something that I think many have just known for a long time, but simply just did not understand. There are many who will not accept this either. I have another interview booked with Dr. Gerhard as soon as his schedule allows. In that interview, we are going to delve deeper into this for a better understanding of what is happening in South Africa right now. Be sure to subscribe to my channel and click on the bell icon so as not to miss that one. Please like and share this video on as many other social media platforms as possible. It is the only way my message gets out. If you have not yet subscribed to my channel, do it now. And as I said a second ago, click that bell icon to get notified every time I upload new content. If you would like to support my channel, in the description section of this video I have provided a way for both local as well as international subscribers to make a contribution. If you would like to make a crypto contribution, I have also provided a Bitcoin as well as a Litecoin address. To those that do support my channel, I say a huge thank you. Be safe out there. Until next time.